Hello, welcome to Why Am I Like This? In 2024, in the month of May, on the 24th day, it's a Venus day in Bolu, Perth, or as I've been jokingly calling it, New Venice recently. And this is an episode of a series called Why Am I Like This? In the Broom Radio, which is a podcast which is published by a spiritual community called The Broom, which is canonically located within the data centers of an app called Discord. um, or I guess in like common time speech, I would say this is a podcast which is published by an organization called The Broom, and we gather and hold space for collective and individual healing within a Discord server. And if you would like access to the server so you can participate in collective healing, and or like discourse about celebrity and hip-hop beef, and you would also like to do a little bit of individual healing on the side, then you can see the link to the Discord in the show notes for this episode. You can go to thebroom.us to find links to join Discord. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio, and you can make a one-time donation if you'd like to support the work we're doing in The Broom. Or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership if you would like to make an ongoing contribution and also gain access to the Discord and also the parts of the Discord server which are reserved for our supporters and for people who, I would say, have invested their time and awareness in making The Broom what it is today, which is, I would say, a safe container for a lot of different things. I guess I'm kind of curious if anybody who's tuning in live would like to add some quote, color, unquote, to my description of the container of The Broom. And I'll also say that if you would like to participate in live sessions, then you also have to be a member of what we call the Pot, which is our membership program supporting The Broom. While I'm also waiting to see if anybody has any contributions to make, either in text or in audio, I'll repeat the guarantee that I have placed upon this container, which is that no context will be enmeshed, and that context will be disenmeshed, and that I will hold space for good faith offering of repair, aka feedback regarding my guarantee. And if your feedback is, what do you mean? I don't know what you mean when you say that context will be enmeshed and disenmeshed, then that would be valid feedback. But I'll just say for now, in the absence of more context on that feedback, I'll say that when contexts are enmeshed, usually it means that people are like stuck. And disenmeshing context helps people to get unstuck. So an example of getting stuck in a particular pair of contexts would be when we get triggered, right? I would say when people get triggered, it's because there's something about the present context which is stuck to a previous context. And I would say that that usually happens because in a previous context, not only were contexts enmeshed, but I would say that contexts were usually enmeshed by conditioning or trauma. which is to say that in those moments, our experience did not feel adequately reflected to us, either because we were not heard or because what other people did in our awareness in those contexts prevented us from feeling as if our experience was accounted for in the calculus which led to their behavior. So my guarantee is basically saying that your experience will feel accounted for in this container, or at least not unaccounted for. And also that in this container, my behavior will help you feel that previous context that you have experienced are more accurately reflected. I'm seeing some people typing. Ashe, thank you for that feedback. And I said I was going to read the question that I chose to answer in this container, but I was just kidding. So I'm going to read it now. And the question is a question I pulled off of the parasocial media platform formerly known as Twitter, currently known as X, which is also a sigil, somewhat more common sigil than the sigil that the artist formerly known as Prince used. But the question, well, is it a question? Yes, eventually. The question comes from a user named relic_radiation or Eleanor. And Eleanor says, well, first of all, I'll say that I asked Eleanor if she was okay with me bringing this question into the container of Why Am I Like This? I didn't get a response. And then I also asked her if she would like to participate in the exegesis of this offering. And she didn't respond to that either, so I just brought it in. And if her track record for responding to my questions or my offerings holds, then it's likely she won't see this offering either, and therefore she can't be upset. But even if she was upset, I would say that what she said is in the public domain, and since I would say, adequately accrediting the offering, I'm not sure exactly upon what basis she might be upset. And with no further ado, I'll say, Eleanor says, I'm noticing multiple healing disciplines, such as bodywork, diet, emotional work, with a pattern of, quote, unmetabolized backlog, unquote. My open questions. Bullet. What is the average amount of unmetabolized backlog carried by most people? Question mark. Bullet. What does life lived from a fully metabolized place look like? Question mark. Compared to one with a backlog. Bullet. How long is the average timeline for clearing said backlog? Definitely, quote, it depends, unquote. But on what and how? Question mark. Wow. What an elaborate and comprehensive set of questions. Eleanor goes on to say, like, it seems like such an obvious pattern that I want clearer maps of it to be culturally available. And, of course, what are the limitations of the backlog frame? When is it helpful to use it and when not? And she's quoting a tweet by somebody named Joe's Purple Shirt, or Jane. And Jane said, I used this frame for a while when I started healing work, but I've mostly dropped it now because, in my experience, some things are unhealable, and there are a lot of ancestral, cultural, and societal constellations that we don't necessarily metabolize but can divest our energy from. And I'm going to hold space to see if anybody has any reflections on that offering. Shay. I'm just responding to some of the favorable feedback on the container of why am I like this that's popping up in the chat, which you can also take part in if you join the pot at buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. I also received a secondary question, which I feel like I can weave into a response on this question, and this question's from Intrepid Bodies from within the Discord, and she says, I have a question abstractly around how work in the unseen relates to constructing and event creating, shielding material reality. Anna says, the part from Jane is intriguing to me. Do you want to say more about that? Like which part? And Hoda says, the word divest really percolates for me. Jane's response. I'm going to read out the response again because it's, I'd say like both of these offerings are quite wordsome. Jane said, I used this frame for a while when I started healing work, but I mostly dropped it because some things are unhealable, and there are a lot of ancestral, cultural, and societal constellations that we don't necessarily, quote, metabolize, unquote, but can divest our energy from. So, Hoda, if you want to say more about the word divest there, and Anna, if you want to say more about Jane's response.
Hi. Um, Thanks for this container. Yes, the word divest in what Jane said, I think for me just kind of took my train of thought into another direction. Like I could feel parts of my somatic awareness like tensing up, um, to almost like prepare for the rest of that statement to show up as something completely different. But the word divest, I think for me has like a connotation, and maybe for like most people, of like releasing like your hold or like your grip or your participation on something so that you can like reinvest it. Like the word reinvest feels like akin to divesting, um, in terms of like energy management, and especially like in the context of it, like in my experiences of like psychic backlog. So it just feels really like potent, and I think divest feels like an active and like an empowering word, I'd say.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I like that you spoke to kind of like activating potential. I was kind of thinking of like shielding, like the BDS movement, like it's like it stands for boycott, divest, and sanction, which I feel like relates mostly to activities in the Levant. And of course, there's a lot of like heightened awareness around what's happening in the Levant, and I'd say like the Israeli nation states regime. And I'm gonna mute because a loud car's coming by. And then, yeah, I feel like this is a pretty, yeah, I liked a lot about what you said about divesting and then the implication of reinvesting, um, which is not necessarily, I would say, present in Jane's response, but I feel like is a very important part. And I feel like links back to what you were saying about event creation. Um, And is saying, I'm trying to feel into if I agree with what she's saying about there are some things that we can't metabolize. Yeah. I feel like if you're divesting, you're metabolizing. Or maybe I'm being too semantic. And yeah, I feel like that links to what she was saying about things being unhealed. Um, I agree. I feel like divesting, similar to what Hoda was saying, is like an essential part of the process of reinvesting. And I feel like when something is divested and reinvested, then perhaps it gets closer to being metabolized and or healed. So I feel like if she's saying that some things are unhealable, or that some things don't need to be metabolized in order for us to divest our attention, I would say that I think that all things can be healed if they result in adequate reinvestment. And I would also say that if we only divest our attention or our awareness, or if we only disenmesh present contexts from previous contexts, and we don't apply that awareness towards what Hoda described as event creation, or I would say like reality creation, or I think Hoda said manifesting material reality, then I would say the material circumstances of our reality cause those wounds to reopen. So it's not that those wounds are unhealable, it's that without adequately dealing with the material circumstances which create the wound, then those material circumstances continue to exist and re-wound us. Um, so I feel like instead of saying that some things are healable and some things are unhealable, I would say that some things are more difficult to heal. And I would say that often the things which are more difficult to heal are things which are older. And then I would also say that some of the things which are more difficult to heal and are older tend to relate to, I would say, more pernicious or more persistent aspects of material reality. So it's not that the previous context is unhealable. I'd say it's more that certain things about the previous context remain part of our present context, right? So I think money is a really good example. I would say that like um, legal frameworks and political situations, certain forms of government are really persistent manifestations of karma. And you can, I think, probably imagine, most people can probably place themselves in a context where they rubbed up against authority, or they wanted to do something, like they wanted to reflect their experience in an action which either would have got them in trouble with the law, or did get them in trouble with the law. Or could say that I'm thinking from my own experience of like being part of an immigration diaspora. There are many things that I would say I would see in my home, and I would say that I was enculturated in, or I would say that manifested in my experience as a result of the experiences of my ancestors, which I did not see reflected in the culture in which I was raised or born. And I would say that all of these, I'll say ruptures, can result in context mesh, right? Or wounding, because of what I said previously about not having our experience accounted for in how people behave towards us, or in the behavior that we observe within the material reality in which we find ourselves. And then each of those moments, I would say, or each of the experience of each of those moments arose from within my body, which took up a certain amount of space in a certain time. And we can never be in that space and time again, and no other body can ever be in that space and time again. So for me, when we are able to bring our awareness to that moment in that space and time and see it or account for our experience, And I would say experience the external reality of that experience, like outside of our bodies in that moment of space and time, in a way that I would say explains how that behavior was not necessarily contingent upon an interpretation of our own behavior, which did not match our own experience of our own behavior. And to concretize that, I'll say, if we can take ourselves back to those moments where we didn't feel seen or heard, or you could say we felt as if we were being deliberately or ignorantly ignored, unconsciously ignored, I'll say. And we can see how other people behaved or the external reality behaved as being independent of our own experience rather than directly antagonistic to our own experience. Then I would say that those spaces and times are healed. However, often the external reality does not change, right? So let's say if I was, I'll take y'all back to moments in my life where I was speaking the kind of English slash like pidgin English or like Hakka that my parents spoke at home when I first went to school, and people were either not listening to me or not responding to what I was saying. Then I would say in that moment, my experience, like my awareness of what I was trying to communicate to other people, did not feel reflected back to me. And I would say that even if I don't consciously blame other people for not responding to me, like in my head, I know that, let's say, the way that I spoke, maybe I spoke more quietly than the other people because of the culture I grew up in. Maybe I didn't use the words that other people use because of the culture I grew up in. Maybe I used the same words that other people use, but I used them in a slightly different order or different intonation or different facial expressions because of the culture I grew up in. And that was different to what other people were expecting because of the cultures they grew up in. Even if I know that in my brain and I can say it now, I would say that in my body, in that moment, or in the space and time of that moment, which experienced both my internal reality and the external reality, there was a clash. And I would say that when there is a clash, then that tends to lead to rupture, right? Like when a glass drops on the floor, if the floor is hard and it doesn't account for the softness or I would say the fragility of the glass, either through becoming soft or by changing its shape in order to cater for the falling and the fragility of the glass, then usually the glass breaks. And to relate that back to space and time of my body, you could say that my space and time, my body was that glass. And because people did not account for my trajectory, cultural trajectory, and the way that it expressed itself, then the glass that was my body shattered. And then it turned into many small pieces. And I would say that the shape of my body was disorganized. And I would say that the way that ends up manifesting in current time is like, you could say, my body in current time still has like the shards of the space and time in which I was ruptured. So you can imagine like in your own body, there's like little shards of glass and how that can cause discomfort, which leads us to be triggered in current time. I guess I'm just going to pause there, see if being quiet can help the integration of all the things I'm saying. And also, I'll read something from the chat. Anna's saying this analogy hits for me, pun intended. maybe. What it says, this is taking me into the soil of my own field, personally. And then I'll say, in order to relate it back to this idea of like divestment, right? So I feel like divestment would then connote taking the shards of glass outside of my body. But then my body's still missing, like you could say, like one of the glasses in the set. Or you could say that like one of the windows in the building, my body is still broken and maybe the glass has been cleared so people aren't stepping on it and re-traumatizing themselves. But there's still like an empty pane, right? And the wind's coming in. And I feel like this also relates to um, propensity for people with unhealed wounds take on attachments to other people or become fixated upon things that they read or learn on social media. The draft. And yeah, I would say that there is a part of like the alchemical process which relates to reforming that glass. So like filling in that window with glass so there is no draft, or reconstituting the glass from the shards and melting it down into another glass so that you have the full set of glasses in your kitchen. um, but then I would say, like, in every present moment, we're still falling. And I would say for the most part, we're still made out of glass, right? Like we still have a karmic trajectory, which I'm likening to falling. And I would say that there's a limit to how much our trajectory can change while we're in our physical bodies. Like we can definitely like de-fixate from the cultures that we came from, but we're still going to be falling down, right? Like you could imagine, like if I'm continuing to be fixated upon the culture of being like Hakka Malaysian brown man growing up in Australia, I might fall like this, maybe to the left a little bit. But if I can defixate from being the cultural trajectory of being a person of color, let's say maybe I'll fall closer to the center. But I'm still in a human body. I still have some need for people to be able to hear me when I'm expressing myself. And if that need is not met, then I'll still shatter, right? Like I still need to be able to raise my hand in a meeting and point out to someone when I feel like they setting a vision for the company that I'm working in which doesn't feel aligned with my understanding of reality. I still need to be able to tell somebody not to say something to me if I feel like it doesn't accurately represent who I am to the people who are around me. Like somebody is inferring that I'm untrustworthy and other people believe that person, then they're less likely to trust me. And then they're more likely to treat me in a hostile fashion or not respond to me. While we're all in human bodies, we still need to be able to eat. We still need to be able to defecate, and we can't say the things that we need to say in order for people to believe us. Then it's less likely for them to give us money. We don't have money, we can't eat. If when we're asking where the restroom is, people don't understand us, then we're more likely to poop our pants. These are all needs that I feel like we can't necessarily, quote, heal ourselves, unquote, from. So in that sense, I would say that I agree with what Jane's saying, but I don't feel like this is what most people would refer to as like a backlog of metabolization. Um, I feel like what Jane is referring to when she's talking about things which can't be unhealed is like when we go back into those moments, we pick up the shards of glass, we reform those shards of glass into the glass that it was, so we're whole in the moment in which we were like ruptured. And we replace the windows so we have the full set of windows, or we replace the glass so we have the full set of glasses. But in every moment, we're dropping glasses. And I would say that the floor has not fundamentally changed. And when I'm talking about the floor in this metaphor, I'm talking about material reality. I'm talking about systems of exchange of currency. I'm talking about legalistic frameworks. I'm talking about cultural mindsets. I'm talking about systems of governance. Um, Probably talking about lots of other aspects of material reality which continue to cause harm and which are very resistant to change. And I'm kind of curious if like anybody who's here wants to shout out or text out any examples of aspects of material reality which continue to harm people, which are difficult to change, even when those people have done that inner work to reclaim those parts of themselves which were traumatized past. Anna says, I feel like I've used the analogy of draining a bathtub and forgetting to fill it back up. Yeah, like divesting but not reinvesting, right? I feel like it's a slightly different like take on it, but I feel like I can definitely see the alignment. Um, so if I reconstitute my body in the moment where I tried to communicate with my new classmates, first went to school in an English-speaking school after having been raised in mostly like a pidgin English or Hakka English or even Hakka Chinese household, I can cure that version of myself. So that version of myself now believes in his body that people weren't trying to harm me by not understanding. But if I don't learn to express myself better and the material reality around me does not evolve to include an understanding of cultural difference, then you could say both the glass is still falling in a way which is like unabsorbable by the floor, and also the floor is still very hard and likely to cause shattering. And I feel like it's important to say that like there's two parts to that, right? Like there's both what I can do in the time between when I was last shattered and the next moment in which I might be shattered. And then there's also like some change that happens in the floor. But I feel like part of this metaphor, which probably needs to expand, is that like what we consider to be the floor is really all of the other glasses of all of the other people that I'm encountering in external reality. And also the environments that they've built and the cultural mindsets, right? So you can kind of imagine that all of these glasses are sort of falling, and some of those glasses are falling together in a line, and some of them falling out of alignment, and some of them are falling kind of out of alignment just a little bit, where it's like, if you think of a plane landing, it's kind of like parallel to the earth, and then it starts to descend, and it's sort of moving in a way that's parallel to the surface of the earth, but also slightly, say, incidental to the surface of the earth. But then it kind of smooths out its landing so it doesn't like crash when it hits the earth, but instead of maybe like bounces a couple of times and then like rolls smoothly, and then all the passengers get off, and then like some of the Germans in the back like applaud, because that's like seems to be the habit when I'm traveling with German passengers. They like to applaud the pilot. Um, and everything goes well, right? So then in that analogy, you can imagine that the falling glass, which is me, has changed the direction in which it's falling. But then also, all of the other glasses have changed their trajectory a little bit as well. So it's like a handshake, right? Like I'm not gonna talk and emote and intone exactly the same way that I learned in my Hakka Chinese household or Hakka Hainanese Cantonese Malaysian immigrant household in Bolu/Perth/New Venice, Australia. Um, so I'm going to change my trajectory and I am going to talk a little bit different. I'm going to like snap my shoulders a little bit to enunciate what I'm saying. And like maybe I'll learn how to play sports so I can learn how to fit in with the Australians a little bit. And I'll play some of their sports, play some of their ancestors' sports, and I'll play some of these sports which are about to become popular in Australia because of TV. Basketball, soccer, which are not traditional Australian sports or not traditional Gaelic, or I would say they are traditional Anglo sports. I would also say that both basketball and soccer have ancient ancestors in places like South America and East Asia and Southeast Asia. And in that regard, maybe those sports could be considered like alchemical solution to the disparities between the sporting cultures of many different natures. Or yeah, what Hoda's saying is calling healed assimilation curves. But yeah, I can do all those things in order to change my trajectory so that it's more aligned with the trajectories of all of the other classmates or classmates, or you could say like the floor of material reality. But I would say that there's a limit how much any one glass can change itself so that it's in alignment with all of the other glasses. And if the other glasses don't also change their trajectories within their limits, then shattering is going to occur anyway. So in that sense, it may appear that some of our backlog, and I have to like scroll up to remember the exact words that Ellen used, because it was like metabolic backlog or something like that. Unmetabolized backlog. Yeah, I would say that the parts that maybe Jane's referring to, but I feel like the parts that Jane's referring to accurately of our unmetabolized backlogs, which can't be healed, refer to, yeah, I would say like the inadequate reinvestment of our reclaimed awareness into activities that relate to realigning the trajectories of all of the aspects of any moment. Like, those wounds may seem unhealed if we don't invest our reclaimed awareness into aligning more with the cultures that we encounter externally as individuals. And I would say that those moments of our unmetabolized backlog may feel unhealable if other people aren't, I'll say, both divesting and reinvesting in being responsive to the cultures that they're encountering in their external reality. And I feel like you can probably tell that I just said the same thing from two different perspectives. But what I'm really saying is that it will feel like we have unmetabolized backlog that cannot be healed for any individual in any culture or any container if all of the individuals in that culture and or container are not reclaiming their awareness from previous trauma and reinvesting it in aligning with one another in a given culture. And I'm just gonna like scroll back down to like read the chat. There I am. It's a group project. That's what I was saying. Yeah, let's say it's a group project. I'd say that most group projects that I've worked in, I tend to do much more work than other people. And I would say the same of most encounters that I have experienced between immigrant diasporas and I would say like incumbent settler civilization, which the immigrants are migrating towards. And, I think a lot of people in those like incumbent settler civilizations would say, well, that just makes sense, mate, because we're here and they're coming here because they need something from us. But I would say that what that perspective tends to ignore is that often there would be no need or there would be no opportunity for the immigrant diasporas to come to those incumbent settler civilizations if those incumbent settler civilizations were taking care of themselves, right? So, like, if they were repopulating themselves instead of experiencing periods of population decay because they were able to maintain a culture which is incentivized to continue having babies and raising them to be elders. I'll say that often people in those incumbent settler civilizations become bewitched by a phantasm which they are presented with in social media and parasocial media and all kinds of media about what kind of lives they can live, so they're no longer interested in doing the work of maintaining their civilization. So there is an opportunity for the immigrant to come in and both help them to repopulate and also do the work of maintaining civilization, which is at least population growth neutral rather than population growth decay. And then I would also say that often those immigrants feel the need to take their labor and I would say their recreative and reproductive vitality to other incumbent settler civilizations because many of the things that they need to survive and thrive in their countries of origin have been taken away by often factions which took them to these new places which they're going to, which I'm calling incumbent settler civilizations. And I think a good example of this is brain drain, right? Like when certain people from like country A start to go to country B, then country A starts to fall apart and country B starts to prosper. And then more and more people from country A are incentivized to go to country B because the prosperity is being gathered there. And I would say the same, not only of like human resources, but also like earthly resources like timber. Gold, oil, um, animal, wildlife. Um, and so, yeah, I feel like often in these cultural encounters, immigrants end up doing a lot more of the work of aligning with um, the resulting culture than the culture which is uh, being immigrated to. And I would say that often more of the trauma is experienced by immigrants than the incumbent population, which, for the most part, like the most traumatic things that happen to like people in the incumbent population is like maybe they see somebody who doesn't look like anybody they've seen before, and that causes them to be scared because they haven't dealt with their own, I would say, nervous system response to uncertainty. And my experience of those experiences is that when people within I'll call them like incumbent settler civilizations, which are very sheltered, tend to see somebody who doesn't look like somebody they've seen before. They'll project their own unresolved trauma onto that person, and then they'll frighten themselves. So, like, my experience of that, because I like to speak from experience, is that often as a child, I was like quite dark skinned because there's a lot of sun, which I'm very thankful for in Perth, Australia. And I appeared dark. And a lot of people who are light skinned would see me and they would be like, whoa, that's unfamiliar. I'm going to project all of these other fearful experiences I've had around dark skinned people onto this person. And I would say that those previous dark skinned experiences were themselves fearful because of even more experiences of unfamiliarity. And I would say I'll track that back all the way to a fear of darkness in general, right? Because I feel like people tend to associate safety with being in the daytime, and they tend to associate nighttime with being unsafe for very good reasons, right? Because I think it's harder to see your predators when it's dark. When it's dark for very long periods of time, say like after volcanic eruptions or during cataclysms or immediately after cataclysms in Earth's history, where people had to live in caves, it was very hard for them to get access to vegetation and other things that rely upon light in order to thrive. And so I'd say darkness tends to be associated with like being predated upon or going through periods of deep scarcity. But I would say that people take that darkness and then they project it onto people who have darker skin, and then they traumatize themselves a lot of the time. And this continues to reify. The irony for me is that dark skin, dark hair tends to relate to melanin, which relates to an ability to turn sunlight into adenosine triphosphate, which is sort of like, sometimes I refer to it as like the base material of awareness. So, which is to say that melanin tends to be associated with like being able to survive and form experience due to the presence of sunlight, which I think is like a good thing. You know, melanin in some ways is kind of like humans' equivalent of chlorophyll in plants, which is used to photosynthesize food for plants from sunlight. And in that sense, I would say that the presence of melanin, in my experience, tends to correlate to more intelligence and a higher capacity for nervous system regulation, which in my experience tends to correlate to a lower likelihood of being triggered and a higher likelihood of being resourced in any given moment, which in my experience tends to correlate to a lower risk of being harmed by those people, which I would say is often at odds with how people who are not familiar with people who are highly melanated tend to regard highly melanated people. And so when, let's say, highly melanated glasses are, I'll say, like traveling along their karmic paths or like their culturalized trajectories, they tend to misalign with the cultural trajectories of non-melanated glasses, such that a shattering occurs. And I would say that often, at least in populations where there's a high proportion of non-melanated glasses traveling along a particular trajectory, then relatively few highly melanated glasses will misalign with the trajectory of those non-melanated glasses, and that will tend to cause the shattering of highly melanated glasses and not so much the shattering of the non-melanated glass. And also you could take it the other way and say that if you have non-melanated glasses, in relatively low proportions, traveling along their trajectories amongst cultures which are highly melanated, then the non-melanated glasses are more likely to shatter in that encounter. And I would say in order to balance my account of these experiences, I would say that less shattering tends to occur when there is a high diversity, not only of melanation, but of culture in general, between many different glasses in a culture, right? So to make that concrete, I'll say that the experience of immigrants from Asia in a white country tends to be gentler when there are also immigrants from Africa, from South Asia, from South America, from Europe, etc. And you could say that the experience of, say, white people immigrating to a European country tends to be gentler if there are also Africans and Asians and South Asians, Southeast Asians and Americans present there as well. Because then you have less of a hard surface of a particular cultural trajectory encountering relatively few different trajectories. And I would say that the mixed trajectory of many different types of glasses can help the trajectory of the incumbent culture to become gentler overall and more variant, and I would say more diverse cultural trajectories can make an encounter that's swirling and moving in many directions so that no glass falls and shatters. And yeah, Anna says biodiversity for the wind, so I feel like you can also see this in forests. You can also see this in thriving ecosystems as they tend to have many, many different um, species or lineages of genetic material present such that they can all keep each other balanced and none of them becomes dominant, leading to the enculturation of an environment which is only favorable to certain species and very unfavorable to other species. And I feel like this example has put me on a very particular trajectory. So in order to create a less particular trajectory, which is more friendly to perspectives coming from different cultural trajectories, I'm going to go look at the question again and see if there is anything in the container which could do with a perspective shift or a perspective that comes from a slightly different cultural trajectory. I mean, I feel like I've spoken for what Jane was saying, but please disagree. And I feel like I've spoken for some of what Hoda was saying, but also please disagree with me there. I'm going to go back and read that. Constructing an event, creating and material reality and work in the unseen. I mean, I feel like the only thing I haven't really spoken to there is like connecting, quote, the work in the unseen to what I've been talking about regarding like reforming glasses or gathering shattered pieces or replacing broken windows. And I would say I've done that probably adequately for like 80% of the people listening, but maybe for 20% of the people listening, there are missing pieces in that bridge. So I'll say that a lot of the work that relates to replacing broken windows or healing glasses is unseen for many different reasons. I'll say one of the reasons it's unseen is because the work's happening, but a lot of people in incumbent cultures, let's say, do not see it. And I would say not necessarily in that case like immigrant versus incumbent, but I would say incumbent in the sense that they have a very fixed cultural trajectory with a very fixed attitude towards what is work and what's not work. So to make it concrete, I could imagine somebody meditating on the moments in which they experience rupture, manifesting as somebody just moving around the world and listening to their surroundings and listening to what comes up inside of them and using what they're listening to outside to, you could say, re-experience moments of rupture inside in a way that's healing and adds perspective, which makes their own perspective of moments of rupture gentler, right? But for most people in fixated cultures that say just listening and moving around the world doesn't look like work, and therefore it looks unseen. And I would say the same of just like lying down and meditating. And I would say the same of any work that happens while people look happy, because I would say in the incumbent culture I'm in, and the cultures I've been in, let's say like what people call a quote Protestant work ethic of the United States of America. And, Australia is like largely Protestantly coded as well. Work tends to be equated with things that you do while you're miserable. And I would say that people who are able to do the work to heal past versions of themselves so that they can show up in every present context more whole, more flexible, more able to embody different cultural trajectories. If that work looks enjoyable, then it's not considered work. And I would say in my own experience of this, when I'm talking to people and they're unloading their unresolved trauma on me, and I'm doing I would say like the electromagnetic heart-based regulation work to make them feel safe to unload this unresolved trauma. And I'm also asking them questions which allow them to bring their awareness to things that they don't normally bring their awareness to. And while I'm listening to them and I'm regulating my own system, because often what they're telling me is at very least different to my experience, or sometimes antagonistic to my experience. Often while I'm doing all of these things, I look like I'm having fun. Like I'm joking, I'm making ironic cultural references, I'm literally laughing, sometimes I'm dancing. Most of the time I'm smiling and I'm being very demonstrative in my body language. And I'd say like all of my external manifestations of consciousness are in some ways guided, not strategically or calculatively by my head mind, but I would say they are a manifestation of the interlinked network of the intelligence of the cultures that I come from. In other words, it's like all of my ancestors in the earth, which I'm linked to genetically by DNA, and then all of the ancestors in the sky that I'm linked to hologenetically by, I would say, the shapes that were present in the sky cymatically as a result of the song of the universe that was playing at the time I was born. All of the ancestral experiences of my ancestors and the earth and the sky sort of entering into this like collaboration, and what comes out of me in this moment is a co-blending of all of those ancestral experiences, which I've managed to incorporate into my body of space and time because of the work that I do in the unseen, which I call alchemical work, or I often call like dismembering and remembering, or spiritual work, or integrity. And that often doesn't look like work to people, and I know that because they don't pay me. But I can tell that it works in the sense that I can tell that it helps them to reconstitute parts of themselves which were like glasses shattered in moments where their experience felt like it was being ignored. And then I can tell that those people become more whole, I can tell that those people become more able to change their cultural trajectory by incorporating all of the ancestral experiences which they've managed to bring online because of the healing work that's happening in the container that I'm setting with my behavior. And yeah, I feel like maybe 97% of the people who are hearing them hearing my behaviors can now probably make the connection between what Hoda was saying and the original question. And yeah, Hoda's saying like an integrated perspective. Yes, exactly. Or integrity is what Anna said, and I would agree. So then I'm going to go back to the container of this question that Eleanor asked. What is the average amount of unmetabolized backlog carried by most people? That's a very difficult question to answer, both comprehensively but also precisely, because I would say that many, many different people have very different unmetabolized backlogs. And in order to compute an average, I would have to look at the unmetabolized backlog of every person, and then I would have to enter it into my supercomputer and come up with an average amount. I'd say I love questions which are more specific. So, like, the way that I would make this question actionable for me personally is like, how much unmetabolized backlog do you feel I carry? If I was trying to make it more actionable for me. But I know Eleanor's a practitioner, so in some sense, I feel like she's trying to understand like how much backlog exists in most people and how much, in some sense, work would it take by those people and other people to metabolize that unmetabolized backlog. And I feel like that question's geared on a practical basis towards like better positioning herself in a marketplace of people who can provide healing, and also understand like how can her positioning, this is just my sense, lead to creating healing disciplines or popularizing or co-creating healing disciplines which are like adequately resourced for all of the unmetabolized backlog in all the people who need or can heal their unmetabolized backlog. But I would say, yeah, the average amount is like a metric fuck ton. To be concise, but not very precise. I would say that, again, if we're looking at like broad populations, like the more actionable question for me is like who that is like reading this question feels like they have an unmetabolized backlog of healing that they would like to heal. And would you like to work with me, or would you like to work with these other people I know and trust? Or what modalities of healing are you familiar with, and would you feel safe with engaging with in order to heal that backlog? And then I feel like you can target towards people who are actually like willing to do the healing and willing to sustain the people who help heal, and also willing to, I'll say, bring awareness to the modalities of healing and the practitioners that they're willing to work with. And I feel like that's really actionable because A, there's a lot of people who aren't reading it. B, there are a lot of people who don't feel like they have an unmetabolized backlog. And C, a lot of those people don't know where to start. So naming particular practitioners, including yourself, can be helpful. And then I would also say getting them to like think about what they know and what they're scared of, and then what they know and what they're not scared of can help them to focus on pathways towards actually healing that backlog. And then you just cut out all the people who don't think they have any healing to do, or don't want to pay for it, or lack the awareness to figure out, some combination of those things. What does life lived from a fully metabolized place look like? I mean, notwithstanding like the open questions about what's metabolizable or healable, and notwithstanding the fact that I'm only me at my current level of metabolization, I would say I could draw upon the literature of spiritual lineages, and I could point towards, say, um, Buddhist monks who consider themselves to be fully metabolized. I could point towards like mythical figures like Lao Tzu, um, or some of the characters from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Um, I could point towards um, Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist, and a few other figures. And I would say like I don't feel like those people were fully metabolized, but they'd done a bunch of metabolization. And based on the accounts of those people, I could say that they lived life without fear. I would say that they lived life without being stressed out about things that already happened or hadn't happened yet or might not happen. I would say that they lived lives which were not constrained by authority figures and the perspective of authority figures, or the perspectives of like the societies and the cultures they lived within as a kind of a sat authority figure, which is to say that they were revolutionary. And then speaking for myself at my current state of metabolization, I would say that I find joy in every moment, and a lot of the work that I do is healing for other people. And I would say it's increasingly well remunerated. And I remain joyful and positive about the movements I've been making, not only to do more work and not only to be paid more for it, but also to reformulate my work slash the work slash other people's work in ways which are more accessible for more people based on their income levels and their trust levels and their current bases of knowledge derived from trust, which is to say, like, ways of metabolizing unmetabolized backlogs, which are not so challenging to people, either economically or emotionally, or in terms of how much time they take. Um, how long is the average timeline for clearing said backlog? Definitely, it depends. Yeah, I mean, everything I said about averages is true. I'll only say in response to this question that the more people that you encounter who are also metabolizing their backlog, the more quickly you will each metabolize your backlog. So I would say that it can be healing to encounter people who are not doing the work of metabolizing their backlogs, but only to a certain point, and only, I would say, if you are also anchored socially, spiritually, electromagnetically, um, sometimes genetically and hologenetically, with beings who are also metabolizing backlogs. Which is to say that it's probably good to make sure that you're surrounded with like spiritually integrated people before you go spending a lot of your time around spiritually disintegrated people. And finally, what are the limitations of the backlog frame? I mean, I would say for me, there's this concept in East Asian internal arts lineages or medicine lineages of being limitless. or boundless, right? So like there's a pose, um, which I think most people know as like wuji, which basically means like without being able to see the top of the tree. And like the top of the tree there is like sort of a poetic way of like gesturing at limitations. So for me, embodying this posture, which means like flow and always be balanced, always be aligned, always be internally integrated, while also channeling our experience, both physically and metaphysically, or both in the seen and the unseen, the heard and the unheard. Um, this posture, which tends to be taught in a way which looks like standing, I would say in each moment is very flexible, right? Both metaphysically and physically. Like, so sometimes we're in a situation where we need to be sitting down, we can still be limitless. Sometimes we're in a situation where we need to be listening to other people, we can listen limitlessly. Sometimes we're in a situation where we have to be talking, I would say we can still be speaking from an integrated place and channeling the perspective of all the people that we're talking to. And I would say all beingness, including my material reality. And I would also say the beingness of people in the moment I'm in, and also in the past moments, and also in the future moments. And I would extend that to um, all aspects of reality, whether or not they appear to be human or non-human, or animal or non-organic or non, including computers. And yeah, I feel like the container of that question is adequately covered. I'm just gonna like scroll text. What's your metabolism like, bro? That's what Anna says. Um, yeah, I think Hoda is basically like talking about how there is a need for encountering each person, quote, personally, unquote, over the course of a few weeks to like really get a sense of like not only like the depth of their unmetabolized backlog, but also texture and its nature. And I feel like what that boils down to is like probably going to need a few sessions with a very integrated practitioner to get a really good sense of how to metabolize that backlog. And that doesn't mean having one session with a good practitioner, or it doesn't mean having many sessions with a disintegrated practitioner. Hashtag psychotherapy and secular modalities. Um, and yeah, Anna says join the broom. I feel like the broom is one place where there are a lot of integrated practitioners, and also the format of contact allows for like a lot of different imprint to be exchanged, right? So usually when people go to therapy, or they go to body work, or they go to acupuncture, they're in acupuncture mode, they're in body work mode, they're in therapy mode, so they're showing up in a very particular way. And then there are all these parts of themselves which are not showing up, like parts which feel like they might be judged, parts which don't like needles, parts which don't like being touched. And I would say that in the broom, it's a very casual environment where people can show up largely however they are, and therefore more of the parts of themselves can show up, and more of their unmetabolized backlog, which is, I would say, attached to those parts, can show up and be seen and be metabolized. But it's not the only place that's like this. I'd say it's like one of very few places that are like this, because not many people are metabolizing their backlogs to use this frame, or doing their healing work, or you could even say reflecting on themselves, or integrating their mind bodies. And yeah, I feel like if you're listening to this podcast, then you're probably more likely to encounter the broom than any other of those very rare places where you can get a lot of contact with integrated practitioners. And I would say that being able to hold space for that kind of contact and that kind of metabolization takes time and it takes presence. And people can only offer that time and presence if they're being paid, because we need money in order to continue feeding ourselves so that we have presence and time to give. And I would say that people cannot give that time and presence if they're multitasking while they're at work in other paid jobs. And they can't give that time and presence if they can't sit down face to face or on text with people because they're required to get another job in order to have their needs met. And I would say in the Broom, it's very efficient and it's very cheap because people can just come in and do the unveiling when they have time. Like, they don't have to book a session, they don't have to commute to an office, they don't have to set aside an hour and a half. They can like just pop in and say things for like a minute and then receive healing. And then they can come back whenever they want and pop in for a few minutes and receive healing. And it's like this approach of metabolizing frequently in small doses works a lot better for a lot of people than, mustering up the knowledge and the courage and the money to book an appointment for a full 1.5, 2 or 3 hours or go on a fucking retreat or something. And then, I think because it's difficult for that to happen, it doesn't happen. And then I would say because, again, like those containers, like acupuncture, bodywork, Zen meditation retreats are so different from most people's lived experiences. I would say a lot of the unmetabolized backlog does not show up to be healed. So with all that said, I'll say thank you for listening to this episode. I would encourage you to support me in being able to like share these transmissions. You can find the links in the show note, but you can go to buymeacoffee.com/nobuhojimicha. You can go to nobuhojimicha.com to book a session, or you can just DM me. But I'd also offer that you can support the Broom by going to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio. And also, if you would like to check out the Discord server and potentially participate in these live sessions and or in some of the healing work that we're talking about, you can find the link at thebroom.us, or you can click on the link in the show notes. But I'd like to thank you for the space and time that you've given to this container by listening to it either live or as a recording. And I would like to give thanks to the people who've shown up live and offered text and gift and audio and perspective to this container. And I can't wait to see you in the next container or in the Broom. Peace.